Hi everyone, we'll be starting soon. Wait for a few more people to join. Okay, we'll make a start then. Good evening, everybody, and a very warm welcome to this BTSS webinar on training and qualifying in the COVID era. My name is Amelia Bauer, and I'm a trainee at Anthony Collins Solicitors, and this year I'm also the Education Officer for the BTSS. I'd just like to start by saying a massive thank you to our panellists for being here tonight, and a special thank you to BCL Legal Recruitment, who are kindly sponsoring this webinar. We'll be starting soon and hearing from our great panellists, but first, just a few housekeeping points to bear in mind. We are recording this session, so please keep your microphone muted and your camera switched off throughout the webinar, just to avoid any interruptions or feedback. Once we've heard from our panellists, we'll begin a Q&A session. Many of you have already sent in some really great questions, so we'll start by going through some of those before moving on to any questions that come in tonight. If you've got a question for our panel or perhaps to an individual panellist, please do submit your questions via the chat feature. Just make sure that you have sent the message to everyone so that we can pick up your question, and hopefully we will get through as many as we can before 8 p.m. So now over to our panel. We are joined tonight by Anne Warren, who's an Associate Director and Non-Practicing Solicitor at BCL Legal, Samantha Holland, Partner and Training Principal at Gowling, Lisa Whitehouse, Senior Associate and Trainee Appraiser at Anthony Collins Solicitors, and last but not least, Jennifer Cabrera, who heads up Shoosmiths' practice recruitment team. Each panellist will be sharing their insight on how trainees can navigate through these unprecedented and challenging times. And we are also grateful that you have taken the time out of your no doubt busy schedules to be here tonight. So thank you very much to our panellists. COVID, of course, needs no introduction, but I thought it'd be good just to start by reflecting on some of the issues that have brought so many of you here tonight to this webinar. The majority of our audience members will be current trainee solicitors, as you'd expect, who may have concerns about how they can make the most of their training contracts, and looking beyond, they may be anxious about securing NQ roles in the next year or so. Many may be working from home for the first time. Some may have even commenced their training contracts remotely and might not have met any of their new colleagues outside of a computer screen, which in itself brings about various challenges when trying to integrate it into your new firm and building working relationships that perhaps would have happened more organically in an office environment. Other trainees may have experienced a disruption to their training contract as a result of the government's furlough scheme, and some have had their start date deferred, which is of course less than ideal. Others may have had to demonstrate a greater flexibility in their role as a result of COVID's impact on particular sectors at their firm, which means trainees are often helping out in other departments at their firm alongside their actual seat work. I'm sure all of us can unite on one thing, and that is, of course, that this is certainly not how any of us would have predicted our training contracts would go. There will, of course, be lots of audience members tonight who are university students and future trainees who share similar concerns and are looking for that insight into how their future training contract may take form. So a big welcome to everybody. It's great to have so many of you here on a Wednesday night, and I hope we can all come away from this feeling slightly more positive and better equipped to face the challenges ahead. So without further ado, I will now hand over to our first speaker, Anne. So if you'd just like to unmute yourself, Anne, and over to you.
Lovely, thanks Amelia. So yeah, thanks Amelia for that introduction and for arranging the event this evening, which I'm hoping you will all find really useful. And thanks to all of you, there's been really good sign up. So, you know, it's obvious people are feeling anxious about their future careers at the moment, and hopefully we can help give you some comfort around that this evening. As Amelia mentioned, my name's Anne Warren and I'm an Associate Director at BCL Legal. I joined BCL in 2011, so a little over 9 years ago now. having previously qualified as a solicitor in 2005 and practiced as a solicitor until 2010. So tonight isn't a sales pitch, so I'm not really going to go into much detail with you about BCL and what we do. You know, we can do that at some of our own events that we'll be hosting. But just to let you know, we're the UK's largest legal only recruitment agency, so we only do legal recruitment. Most of our consultants are legally trained, and many are non-practicing solicitors who, for one reason or another, have chosen to switch careers paths. And in terms of the way we approach our work, we all work in discipline and location-specific markets. We have full UK coverage, including now Scotland. So if you need any information about any discipline in any location in the UK, then we will have a consultant who can help you. So I'm going to work through now some of the points that Amelia's asked me to cover during the talk. In particular, what changes we've seen in legal recruitment during the pandemic. So if we just go back to March, when it was really looking quite bleak, at that point, most roles at all levels were pulled by law firms or put on hold. Some job offers were rescinded, some start dates were deferred, and firms were understandably very cautious about recruitment. There was just a freeze across the board, really. During the next few months after that, it remained pretty much the same. And so the bulk of us here at BCL Legal spent a period on furlough. By August, the market had started picking up enough that we started bringing consultants back into the business to support the skeleton staff that we'd had in place throughout. And we're now back up to full capacity. So that wouldn't be possible if there weren't jobs to fill. So it just shows how much the market has picked up for us to be able to bring back all of our recruitment consultants. I'd say since early September, we've seen really big strides forward, and from speaking to various HR managers and partners at different firms, they've all said, you know, they can feel things picking up at their own firms as well. So it's getting busier and busier every week. At the moment, just to give you an idea, we've got 508 live jobs that we're working on. That's across all levels, so not just NQ roles, but across all levels throughout the UK. So we'd normally have more than that, but just to let you know, it's still a good number. There's still a lot of vacancies out there. We're also seeing regular placements by consultants, and moving forward, every week pipeline's looking stronger and stronger. So I think we had 50% more interviews even this week as compared to last week. And so the market's really looking a lot more positive. So I think the first message I'd like you to take away today is just not to panic. The market's improved dramatically since March, and it's improving all the time. So, if you're qualifying March, September, I think by next year we're going to be in a much better place again. In terms of the areas that we've seen that are busy and those that we've seen that are quieter, employment, as you might expect, is really busy. So there's been a lot of activity going on in employment, more roles now than there was prior to COVID. That trend is likely to continue as the job retention scheme winds down and the job support scheme begins. So employers are going to have to make more difficult decisions about their employees, which in turn is going to turn into more employment work for lawyers. Restructuring and insolvency, inevitably some businesses won't survive COVID, so that is an area that we've seen getting busier. Sectors like travel, tourism, hospitality, some retailers, they've all really felt the hit of COVID. So in a sense, we're lucky being in an industry which doesn't require face-to-face contact, and technology and so on has meant that we can pretty much continue as usual, provided the work's there. Conveyancing has been very busy since the housing market reopened, partly perhaps due to the stamp duty holiday, and also just pent-up demand. And we're seeing more and more people making the decisions to move out of bigger cities as location plays an increasingly smaller role in terms of where your job's based and where you live. Private client is another area that's been busy. We're seeing lots of instructions in private client as firms are getting more and more work in wills, tax planning, and sadly probate instructions. Family has also remained steady, but actually with a surge since lockdown. Divorce inquiries we're hearing have increased, so there's a lot of work in that area, perhaps due to couples having so much time together and potentially financial pressures that they're facing. Litigation, again, is also really steady, so commercial litigation, property litigation, construction litigation, still plenty of work in all of those areas. And personal injury and clinical negligence have also remained steady. So, you know, most areas we are seeing have picked back up and are now busy. The quieter areas, as was the case in the last recession, are those transactional areas. So corporate and commercial property or real estate projects. So those are the areas that we're seeing that are a lot quieter. In terms of redundancies, we haven't seen a huge amount. Real estate is probably where we've seen the most redundancies, but the figures for those redundancies are nowhere near what we saw in the last recession. So, you know, the market is looking a lot brighter for you guys than it was for people back then. And even in those areas that are quiet, we still have vacancies and NQ vacancies. So there are still opportunities, even in the quieter areas. I had a chat with my in-house colleagues earlier today as well, and so I should clarify I do recruitment for private practice only and in Birmingham city centre. And I spoke to my in-house colleagues that cover Birmingham earlier, and they said that on the NQ side, in-house vacancies are few and far between, but saying that they have made a few NQ placements this month for candidates who have got prior commercial experience in-house. So again, there's still going to be opportunities for you in-house as well as private practice. In terms of the market and the forecast for March and September qualifiers, it's really difficult to say at the moment. As I've mentioned, there's lots of busy areas. There are plenty of opportunities. If you are qualifying in March and you don't yet know if there is a role for you at your training firm, then you should be in touch with us now, and you should start looking now and have your CV together. If you're a September qualifier, then I'd say it's really difficult to say at this point what the market's going to look like, but you know, the signs are looking positive. Amelia asked me to also cover what I thought the main challenges for the next generation of NQs might be. So retention rates, as you might expect, have dipped quite considerably at some firms, which will mean that potentially there'll be more of you looking for NQ roles and more competition than usual for those NQ roles that go external if you haven't got an option at your training firm. But like I say, there are a lot of vacancies. I don't think, to be honest with you, there's any huge challenges for you guys as compared to trainees that have trained during a more stable time. I think, you know, technology has helped. Having remote supervision seems to have worked fine. So I don't think there'll be any major challenges for you looking further forward. In terms of maximising your chances of securing an NQ role, I think the first thing all of you should be doing is speaking with your firm, finding out what the situation is internally, finding out if there are likely to be roles in the areas that you want to qualify into, and then trying to scope out, you know, what your internal competition looks like. If you are qualifying in March, as I say, get in touch with us now, still prepare your CV. You know, even if there are roles for you at your training firm, it might be that you want to take a step up to, say, a national or an international firm, or you know, you don't feel the firm that you're training at is quite right for you. So you can still explore the market, but in all likelihood, most of you would probably prefer to stay at your training firm. So hopefully there will be roles internally available. It might be worth, if all of your training seats haven't already been set, to see if you can request seats in those busy areas that we've talked about. So employment, restructuring would be good areas to get some experience in right now. Also, make sure that you're on LinkedIn. As businesses and law firms tighten their purse strings a little bit, then a lot of firms and internal recruiters will go out to the market and look for people directly in the first instance before coming to us. So they're going to be looking for you on LinkedIn. So make sure that you're visible on there to those firms and recruiters that might be looking for somebody with your kind of profile. Also have a backup plan. So you might need to be flexible on either location, discipline, or firm size, or kind of the ranking, you know, whether you're looking at a tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 type team to secure a role. But be flexible and think about, you know, what are your must-haves and which areas, you know, you can afford to be a bit more flexible with. And I think be really open-minded. So don't discount opportunities until you've found out more about them. I think the market is not going to be as busy as it is usually. Then there aren't going to be as many options available to you. So if you need to look at a smaller firm, then it's worth doing that. If you need to consider a slightly different discipline that still ties in with what you want to be doing long term, then consider that. A lot of the time we'll have people say, you know, they don't really want to look at a particular firm because of things they might have heard from friends or colleagues. But I think it's always best for you to go and find out for yourself, at least put yourself forward, hopefully get an interview, have that conversation with the people that you would be working with. And at least from that point, you can make an informed decision. You know, it's a two-way process, an interview. So, you know, it's as much about you finding out about the firm, about the role, about the team, and getting a feeling for if there's a natural fit there for you, as it is the other way around. So you've got nothing to lose, really. And also interviewing at the moment is a lot easier than it is normally. So most interviews are taking place over Zoom or Teams. So you only need to really set aside an hour in your day to really find out a lot more information about a role before kind of making a decision as to whether it's something you want to explore further. I think that pretty much covers my section. I will be answering some more questions later on, but now I'll hand over to Sam Holland, who is a commercial litigator, partner and training principal at Gowling. Hi, Sam.
Perfect. That was seamless, wasn't it, Amelia?
Thank you.
Hello everybody. It's really good to be here. I think everyone's basically done my introduction for me, but yes, my name's Sam Holland. I'm a partner in the commercial litigation team at Gowling. I qualified there in 2000, so I can barely believe it myself, but I've been there 20 years now. I was a trainee supervisor for many years. I am also an individual principal, trainee principal for a number of individual trainees. It's a bit like a sort of sponsor mentoring program that we run at the firm. And then I'm also overall training principal for the firm. I'm really happy to be here today and speaking to so many of you on a topic which I know is something which is a huge concern to you all at the moment. And I really hope that you'll come away from this evening feeling positive and with some tips about how to put yourself in the best possible position going forward. Amelia's asked me in my slot to talk a little bit about what specifically we have been doing and what we have been seeing at Gowling, and then also to cover some general thoughts on what's been going on. So in terms of how COVID has affected training at Gowling and whether we think there's a difference in the learning training experience when you're working at home, I think the short answer to that is yes, of course it will feel different doing your training contract working from home, but as our trainees and our fee earners and supervisors have got a new way of working, we're finding that it doesn't really impact the quality of training that our trainees are receiving. It does, I think, require the trainee and the supervisors to take a bit more responsibility for providing feedback and for seeking out supervision. And it is definitely not as easy to learn by osmosis, by which I mean that kind of natural process that you get from being in an office sat next to more senior lawyers and hearing them talking to clients and talking to colleagues about particular matters. So it definitely does require a bit more creative thinking on how the training can be delivered, but that's probably not such a bad thing. In terms of what is actually happening at our firm, communication is really important. So our trainees and our supervisors are having regular catch-ups on Zoom to discuss workloads and objectives for their seat. As I mentioned earlier, each of our trainees is allocated their own training principal, and that's a partner who will sponsor them throughout the whole of their 2-year training period. So trainees will also have regular meetings with their training principal, and they can help sort of navigate them through their training contract in these more difficult circumstances. And then there's also a lot more online learning, so the PSC, team training, learning and development courses that are being run centrally. But a lot of the feedback that we have is that those courses are running just as well virtually, and in some respects, actually, they're a bit easier to attend online than they might be in person. How have we supported our trainees during the pandemic? I really do feel for trainees during this time. It is a tough time for everybody in terms of our mental health, but particularly those just starting out on their legal career. And we're really mindful of this at Gowling. We've got a number of measures in place. So our trainees get resilience training from Leading Minds, which is a provider of resilience and mental health training for the legal industry. And they get access to Leading Minds podcasts and webinars. I mentioned that our trainees have got a strong support network, so they'll have their supervisor, their training principal, they'll have me to come and talk to, and I try and speak to as many of them as I can, as often as I can, and the early talent team. And we are all completely invested in the development of our trainees and taking that extra time to stay in touch with them and find out how they're doing and how they're getting on working from home. Like all of our employees, they have access to Gowling's Wellbeing Hub, which has a huge variety of resources to help us all keep on top of our mental health. And in fact, that is publicly available as well. So I'd encourage everybody to have a look at that. And on a more practical level, our trainees, like everyone else across the firm, they have been given a contribution towards home IT equipment so that they can make life as comfortable as possible while they're working at home. They're not crouching over their laptop at the kitchen table or on the sofa. Okay, more generally, how can this generation of trainees continue to learn when working from home? Training and development is, in my view, a two-way street, and it has always been the case that trainees need to take control of their own career and development, but I would say perhaps now more so than ever. Again, as I said earlier, that means that you need to be a bit more creative, I think, in the current circumstances, but I don't think that's a bad thing. I'm afraid to say that having been in this job for 20 years, this definitely won't be the first unexpected change or setback that you will come across in your career. And learning how to be resilient and creative and flexible is going to be really important in giving you the tools to deal with that going forwards. It's just that you're all having to do that perhaps a little bit sooner than others. Some possible tips for you. I think be proactive. Don't hold back from asking for more work from your supervisor or other members of your team if you have capacity. Make sure that you're scheduling calls with your supervisor to discuss what you're doing and what you'd like to do a bit more of. And actively, as always, seek out work for a range of different fee earners so that you're getting to experience their varying working styles. Once you have done a job, actively seek out feedback. If someone's marked up your document and they haven't told you why, ask them if you can grab 5 minutes with them to run through it. At the end of a particular matter, ask your supervisor how they think you did and how you could have done better. As I mentioned earlier, one of the things that is quite tricky is learning by osmosis, just by being next to somebody in the office. But it's not impossible to try and achieve that remotely. If you ask your supervisor to keep you in mind whenever they're doing client calls, even if, if you've got time, even if you're just on that call to listen and take a note, I mean, I will always welcome a trainee coming on to my call to take an attendance note, frankly. But it means that you get to hear how they're dealing with the clients and how they might be dealing with the other side. Equally, if they're doing internal catch-ups with other members of the team, ask them to bear you in mind for that as well. Can they join you into those conversations so that you can hear things being discussed internally as well? And the other thing that we have done at Gowling's in some of our teams is we've had open Zoom sessions. So effectively, we have team members who have Zoom open for a morning or an afternoon, and they're literally working at their desk, but alongside everyone else at the same time. So that might be something that you could consider doing with your supervisor, perhaps a morning or an afternoon a week, just to sort of hear them talking or talk through things with them. In terms of NQ recruitment, at Gowling, we haven't seen any significant changes. In fact, I think, as Angharad said earlier, it's almost slightly easier to do it remotely. We were really, really pleased to retain 100% of our trainees who qualified in September. We take a really long-term view when considering what NQ roles we have available, and the current climate hasn't changed that. So all of our teams looked beyond the current climate to consider whether they had a need for an NQ. There are several of our second year trainees who want to qualify early in March, and we're talking about them in the same way as we would do in normal circumstances. In terms of the challenges for the next generation of NQs, and are there any positives to take from the situation? I would say don't despair. I think there really are some positives that you can take from all of this. Firstly, having sort of lived and worked through it, I do think this does feel very different from the 2008 recession. We did have a bit of a pause to take stock at Gowling, and we did have some staff that were furloughed and that were on reduced hours. But we have actually been really quite busy over the last few months. And all of our staff that were furloughed will be back by the 1st of November and up to 100%. The areas that we're particularly busy in are those that Angharad mentioned earlier, so restructuring, employment. I'm a litigator, and that does tend to be counter-cyclical, and my team has been horrendously busy dealing with existing matters, but also we've been picking up new work through opportunities that have been thrown up by COVID and Brexit. So we are dealing with quite a few policyholder claims where businesses have had to shut their premises in March, and they're now looking to recover their business interruption losses. We're dealing with force majeure claims. So there are actually some opportunities that you can see coming out of this situation as well, which are throwing up new areas of work. Equally, I do quite a lot of support work with our transactional teams, and whilst again there was a bit of a pause, I would say at the beginning of lockdown, our corporate and our real estate teams have actually been much busier than expected. So it's definitely not all doom and gloom, even if you are particularly interested in qualifying into some sort of transactional role at qualification. In terms of other positives, I think that forcing us all to work flexibly, and it really was forcing some of us to do that, because a lot of my colleagues really like being in the office, and forcing us to work from home has made us all take a really long, hard look at our previous working practices. And I know that at Gowling, and I'm sure across the board, everyone is really putting this under the spotlight. I would be really surprised if, when we come out of this situation, we don't see more flexible arrangements going forwards, and that is going to be a huge positive, I think, in terms of the work-life balance for the next generation of lawyers. Finally, what advice do I have for current trainees who are approaching qualification in March or September? Stay positive. I would absolutely reiterate what Anne Harrod has said. You need to take control of your own career. Don't just sit back and think that you will qualify where you trained. Make sure you sort out your CV early. Speak to legal recruitment agencies early. You might be surprised and find actually you do fancy a move after all. 20 years ago, when I got offered a job where I trained, I had already been out and spoken to legal recruitment agencies, been interviewed by what was then RAGs, and decided that actually I fancied a move after all. So you just never know. I'd be interested on Anne Harrod's views on this a bit later on, but I think it's also really good to be flexible. I wouldn't necessarily box yourself in too much at this stage. Keep an open mind about what sort of firm you might want to qualify into or where you might want to qualify, and perhaps think about in-house roles too. I think the more flexible you are, the better. If you are staying where you trained, be proactive, reach out to your team before you qualify, find out what you're going to be working on, get up to speed on that, ask about how supervision is going to work, make sure you have everything you need in place before you hit the ground running on qualification. And finally, I would recommend that you keep yourself up to date. So keep an eye on what's happening in the legal press, what's going on in your local law society and the trainee solicitor group. Are there any other relevant industry bodies that you could join that might be relevant to your area of qualification? Keep an eye out for external training sessions that might be relevant. So for example, council run an awful lot of webinars that you can usually join remotely. And also think about your softer skills. So as I mentioned earlier, communication skills are absolutely critical at the moment. So that's all from me at the moment. As I'm also very happy to answer questions later on, but in the meantime, I'm going to hand over to Lisa.
Thank you. So this is my first ever webinar while sitting in my spare room. So as with everyone, I imagine, and that really just shows you how much things have changed. If you just said a year ago I'd be talking to 98 people from home, I would have said I wouldn't have believed you. So I think the main positive thing to take from all of this is how flexible law firms have been. I'll get to this in a minute, but I don't want to repeat a lot of what Sam has said because Anthony Collins has been very similar in their approach. But I think most firms were resistant to agile working. And now I think it's going to be the starting point, which is positive from the point of view of, to be frank, profit making, working well. Office spaces come at a huge cost. So I think all the law firms I'm involved with, I think we can rest assured really that we've responded very, very quickly and very well. And I think that bodes well for the future, particularly for the current trainees. Also as well, trainees do cost quite a lot of money to train. So the starting point is for most firms is you want to keep your trainees. So let that have a bit of a positive outlook for yourselves also. I'm work with Anthony Collins Solicitors, so we're a different type of law firm, and this is a second career for me. So I left school without many qualifications and went straight into the manufacturing industry and worked through the 1990s recession in the manufacturing industry, which was most hit then. Then I did a degree and qualified in 2010, trying to get a training contract in 2008, right into the next recession. So it's interesting really how I think that if you work hard and you're focused and you do a good job, I think that a recession will not have as much of an impact on you as trainees as potentially and hopefully you think it might do. Also, in 2008, as Ankard was saying earlier, it was a very different type of recession. So it came from the 1980s, basically too much money was spent. And the following decade, or the 1990s paid for that. But in 2008, the issue from that was the credit crunch. So there was basically, we borrowed too much. What happened in 2008 then was quite a lot of the law firms, when you had this recession, got rid of quite a lot of their real estate lawyers, private client lawyers, and lawyers that they didn't deem profitable. That actually worked well for me personally and lots of lawyers who are my peers, because there is a shortage currently of private client lawyers of my PQE. So from my perspective, actually, it's worked out in a way in that there is lots of job opportunities for me. So it's not all doom and gloom in respect of qualifying in a recession. I really don't think that the law firms are going to want to make that mistake again. Lots of law firms are trying desperately to recruit private client lawyers and other lawyers who during the last recession were made redundant or weren't trained. So particularly our firm, we're very keen that we don't want to be in that position again, particularly as we don't know really when we're going to come out of this recession. So, and I don't think it's going to take as long as it did for the previous recessions, because this has been completely different. Nobody here has been in a position where there's been a global pandemic. But I think law firms have been flexible, the technology was there. So actually, I don't think there'll be a huge impact on the legal sector. It has affected training, I think, because of, as Sam was saying, the osmosis and the lack of being part of a team in a pod. We used to sit, as you do, in a pod with desks and open plan, used to overhear conversations, make each other a cup of tea, that broke up your day. You got to know people on a personal level and you overheard conversations. I think we are going to struggle to replace that, but we are trying. As Sam was saying before, we really, really value feedback from the trainees. So the more feedback you can give us on what's working and what isn't working, the better. This is the first time we've done this too. So if you can be vocal and if you can contact people, they will welcome it. I think also working from home as a trainee is different, because there can be a lack of visibility potentially. And so it's how you work on that, how you remain visible as part of the team. Most firms now have set aside team meetings, I imagine, where you have Mondays, Wednesdays and Fridays, we have a team meeting where everyone clicks into Teams and we catch up as people with a cup of tea. Bring something to that meeting, read an article, bring a question, have some visibility so that you add to that internal meeting, because that's your cup of tea moment and that's your catch up in the pod. And if you aren't visible there, then people don't have you in the forefront of their mind when giving you work. So do stay with that and do keep a visibility and do keep talking to people. We've supported our trainees the best that we can. We have a quite supportive environment anyway. We have a trainee manager and we have a trainee appraiser, and we have a lady in HR and also a trainee principal. So we have quite a good structure. What we've done with our trainee in the private client team is given her 2 trainee managers to just take awareness of the fact that it's going to be a different job for the trainee manager also. So she's got 2 people to come to for direct line management. She's got everybody in the team, she attends the team meetings, and also she'll have a separate trainee appraiser and somebody through HR. So we're really doing our best to support the trainees. Working from home, we do recognise that it's tiring, or it was tiring to begin with, because you get more screen time than ever. So we really do encourage our trainees not to work long hours, to have screen breaks, to take into fact that if you sit and stare at a laptop for 8 hours, you are going to be tireder than if you move around and flip between client meetings. So break up your day. And we are supporting and talking with our trainees to make sure that they're doing that. And also from a mental health perspective, it can be a little lonely if some of our trainees have moved from other areas. So we're trying to bear that in mind and involve them as much as we possibly can. But as Sam was saying before, it's down to you as well. So the more involved you can be, speak to trainee managers in other seats, speak to trainee appraisers, speak to trainees in the year above you, and be as involved as you can. The comparisons between qualifying between the last recession and this one, I think the last recession was a bit more of a boom and bust recession. So I think it was a lot more of a recovery period. I think this one hopefully will be a less of an issue, recovery going forward. NQs as well. Be careful that you, when you qualify, that you, between NQ to 3 years, talk to your, in the departmental team that you qualify into, so that you don't fall into a different area. We're very focused on trainees, and trainees have their own groups, and we have teams and meetings for different levels. But I think NQ to 3 years PQE, if this continues, we are going to have to really be creative and think about what we do to develop them, because that's where we learn to be a solicitor, or certainly where I did to be a solicitor. So we want to make sure that we're available and we continue with the training and support for potentially longer than we would. Just recognising the fact that the trainees qualifying are going to be the first ever trainees that are qualifying with this remote working. So we're looking at that as well as a firm. And I think that's the biggest challenge as an NQ. I think, as I was saying before, as everyone was saying before, flexibility is really key. I actually, when I trained, wanted to be a family lawyer. That was my starting point, until I found out what a terrible litigator I would be. But I had the courage, after doing the training contract, to change and go into private client. Private client was actually suited to me much better than a family, and also it has given me a career I really enjoy. So even though if you'd have asked me when I was midway through my training contract, I was a family lawyer through and through. So do have the confidence to change. And also, if you started your training contract with an idea of what lawyer you want to be, don't be worried about changing, because you will potentially end up qualifying into a team that you hadn't even thought about. So the busy teams who potentially before wouldn't have been able to offer a seat now have a business need. As a private client lawyer, we have never been busier. Remote working has unlocked client bases that we didn't have before. We have the ability now to assess capacity using assessors virtually. And that's only going to continue. So the changes that one area, one firm and me as a lawyer have managed to do flexibly over the past 7 months or so, I think is a positive that we can take from this. And that if we can do this as a firm from March, and we're still doing it now, I think that the future is only positive. I think, yes, we will have challenges. I think remote working will continue as the norm, with coming in 1 or 2 times a day. However, you can be the NQs that never have that 2-hour commute or stuck on the train. So it releases some time for you for personal development, which I think from an NQ or 1 to 3 year PQE, I commuted and I read on the train, but that's not the same. So I think the future is quite bright myself, for firms, the legal sector, and for you as a collective group of trainees. So I think that's my 10 minutes up now. So the next person we've got is Jennifer from Shoosmiths. She arrived.
Hi.
Oh, hello.
Hi. So my name's Jen. Thank you so much, Lisa and Sam. That was really helpful. Just gives me a good starting format. I have created slides. It seems like the only person that did. So I feel a little bit silly in that regard, but nonetheless, at least it gives me some guidance in terms of what I can talk through. So I basically look after all of the qualified recruiting for the firm. I've been doing this for more years than I take credit, because then otherwise it starts to show my age. But just to kind of give you a little background in terms of who I am as a person, I grew up in New Zealand, although I don't sound like it. But I moved to the UK in 2007, just before the original, well, the last recession. And so I have worked through recruitment, probably similar to Angharad. I've worked in this industry, in this city originally, and have been doing recruitment for law or professional services ever since. So I think I know what I'm talking about, but I learn every day. So in terms of today's session, I just kind of wanted to explain who we are very briefly, and how, I guess, qualifying this year has changed in some way. So for those of you who don't know us very well, we are one of the national law firms in the country. We are located in 13 different areas in the UK, although we've got more offices, so to speak. But we are dotted all around the country. London is a very small part of a bigger national footprint, which has its own challenges, because I think, when you're a trainee and if you've come from a non-London background and there's a London office, there's always that pull, isn't it, for wanting to qualify in London, and I'll get to that in a little bit. So we have about over 1,000 lawyers. We've got about a little over 200, I think 230 partners now. We've done actually quite well throughout the most recent issue that we're facing with at the moment. Similar to many other law firms, we did have to take a pause in terms of what COVID really means for us as a firm. But in terms of the numbers, we were one of the first firms to publish what it looked like for us, and it does look very promising. So I'm not going to talk through, I guess, all of the facts. They're there anyway. But in terms of, I guess, where we specialize, and we don't do a lot of international work. We are genuinely a UK focused firm. We are a member of the World Services Group, which is a group of international law firms that do referrals. So actually one of our IP partners chairs that. So for any international work that we do refer them on through the World Services Group. So I guess from distinguishing us from other law firms, I think given our size, we are still very much indeed a UK-centric organization. Next slide, please. So I guess just to kind of put a little bit more context in terms of where we're based. These are where we're located. Historically, we were known to be more Northampton based or Milton Keynes as we speak, but over the years, from 200 years ago, we have grown in several different places. Our most recent office that I was actually quite lucky to be part of opening was our Belfast office. We've also just moved into new premises over there, and we do have some very promising recruitment drive for those locations. Next slide, please. So qualifying at Shoosmiths 2020 and beyond. So I guess what's changed for us? Next slide, please. So what was and what is now? So in terms of what's really changed for us on the qualifying side, naturally the roles, because of the way that we're set up, and I made the deliberate point to kind of show the different offices that we have, the trainees are appointed based on where the projected roles are likely to land in the 2-year period. And they then get reapproved at the end of just before someone qualifies at the end of their 2 years. Where that's become a little bit challenging is that we would run, for example, an initial wish list of where we think the roles are, and we would then take advice from our trainees in terms of which practice areas and which locations they would like to qualify in. And then we would then put a business case around that. On a good year, we would always have more jobs than trainees. This year, however, we had a slight opposite of that. Just not because we couldn't make the offers, it was just we were just pretty much waiting to hear from our clients at the time. And actually, just to give you some results on how that worked out for us, we've kept 96% of our trainees, albeit 76% are on permanent contracts, And we have extended offers to the remaining trainees where we're waiting for the jobs to land. So that has changed. That has changed, but we are trying to do our best in terms of making sure that there's jobs for everybody. In terms of home working, for us, that was actually a very seamless transition. We had always been an agile firm, and everybody was always set up to work remotely. So to become a completely home working workforce overnight was actually pretty straightforward for all of us. The nice thing that the firm actually did was they sent out laptop packs literally 2 days after we went in lockdown. So that included a keyboard, a big screen, or 2 big screens if that's what you were used to, a laptop stand, and then the office chairs came together with a workspace assessment to make sure that you had the right type of chair, for example. And then we're all getting upgrades on our phone system. So we all, I have the same setup at my home as I would do if I went into one of our offices. So that's been really good. In terms of the changes within the legal recruitment market, this is a really good question because there's 2 sides to this. There's the internal trainee population, and there's also the external market that I recruit for predominantly. And so the key changes to that really, as I said, I think firms just generally had to take a pause all around Easter time in terms of what was happening. I think the key distinction to remember in the 2007-2008 recession, the whole industry was just over-lawyered. So there were a lot more redundancies. So when I mean over-lawyered, we had, there are pockets of like capital markets and in finance that don't, there's just no appetite for that anymore. So if you compare that to this recession, law firms are a lot leaner in terms of how they structure their teams generally. So although there are news of firms having restructuring and a streamlined process, you won't see, not that I've seen anyway, as much of a dropout, or they're not mass redundancies that took place in 2008. I don't think we will see that this year. I mean, it's really reassuring to hear that quite a lot of the other firms have maintained a very busy pipeline and have a positive outlook for the next few months. So I guess in terms of what we're looking like for March and September this year for qualifying, I'm not going to lie, the last few weeks have been pretty busy for me in recruitment generally, both internally and externally, because everybody's now coming back full time as of the 1st of November. We also had people from furlough, but everybody's been slowly being phased back in. To be honest, I've been full-time the whole time. And we would be looking to bringing everybody back in as of the 1st of November. That's generated a lot of jobs. You also have to remember that there's also natural attrition. So throughout all this, people on furlough had to sit around and think, what am I doing with my life? I'm going to go and set up my own gardening business. There are a couple of people in our firm that one is moving. I just found out one is moving to Grenada. They bought a business in Grenada and setting up over there. So you have to think about the natural attrition rate. So there's some things that are just going to change moving forwards. And if we're already running a lean business, there's not enough lawyers. And we can only, if things continue to get better, if we continue to recruit in the way that we have been, and if we are, obviously you've got Brexit, and Brexit, as we all know it, is actually a really good thing for lawyers because everybody needs lawyers with the new policy changes moving forwards. I can only really expect for things to really get better. So as of today, I've had, coincidentally, 6 new jobs within the real estate division released to me today. So although one would think that, real estate has been quite a quiet market, there are new opportunities that are being created. So, don't despair. There is light at the end of this tunnel. In terms of secondments, we've continued to have actually secondments for all trainees and all newly qualified legal advisors. They've continued throughout the pandemic, and that's irrespective of whether they work from home. Actually, they just work from home. there's no irrespective, they just work from home. So the client service has continued all throughout that. And in terms of the availability of roles for each location, to be honest, I've not actually seen that much of a change from the wish list. I probably, the only other main place that I can see where there's been a lot of recruitment activity, when I mean activity, a lot of candidates requesting for jobs, is the north. So you've got Manchester, Sheffield, and Leeds. There seems to have been quite a lot of activity in those locations, and also Thames Valley. But unsurprisingly, London's always, it's always going to be popular. But I do think that with how the new working arrangements are going to be moving forwards, you don't need to live in London to work in London nowadays. So that's just one thing to bear in mind. So what are the key things that, the challenges for the next generation of lawyers? I think the main difference that I've noticed in the last 6 months is certainly the building impact. If you're working remotely, it's going to be hard to be remembered. So making sure that you continue to speak to your colleagues, speak to your friends, speak to your peers about what's going on in their current teams, speak to your current team in terms of what deals there might be in the pipeline. If you see something in the press that interests you, that your team or your division's getting busy with, ask somebody, pick up the phone. Don't be afraid to ask questions. I do know that there were some hesitations as to, oh, do I keep calling the same person? But don't, I think if there is anything to take away from this experience is that a person's only a phone call away. and it's really, really important to build your profile, and it's going, you never know what that person on the other phone might just tell you. I guess in terms of what trainees can do to maximize their chance for securing an NQ role. Well, again, I don't want to cover the same patch as what Lisa and Samantha have already covered. They've given some extremely good advice. I think just the key thing is make sure that you keep your profile up to date. When I mean profile, not just your social profile, but in terms of networking within your peers and networking within the firm. Make sure that they remember you. Get involved with CSR activities, any fundraisers that you can get your hands to, any socials or team meetups that you can join, do it. And also, again, one important thing is speak to your peers and speak to your friends. Some of the more successful recruitment that we do have been with recommendations from friends, and you never know. They might just say, oh, actually, so-and-so's team and over on the other side, or I know someone might be looking, and that's your way in. And I say that obviously, please come to either me or Angharad if you're looking for a job. But sometimes a recommendation is always better, right? And I guess in terms for advice for NQs moving forwards, I think flexibility has already been covered, so I won't go too much into detail. But that is very, very important. Don't shy away from a challenge. One of the things that I do tell candidates, and I speak to by the thousands, on any given year, impact is going to be very important. And your learning experience as well, being able to articulate what you've learned from something is going to be really important, and your involvement. Okay, those two things are the key distinguishing aspects of what a good interview would look like. Okay, and I don't think a lot of NQs do, I think when you get asked a question, I work with this or I work with that. But actually the key thing is understanding the value of you and articulating that at interview. Okay, and sometimes it's also understanding a law firm's a business at the end of the day, and I'm a business major also. So unless you make your firm's business your business, how are you going to secure a job there? And how do you see yourself being a lawyer in that place if you don't understand the pressures, the challenges, and how you can develop within that firm? So make sure that you remember those key things when you are looking for jobs and when you are talking about a future career, in not just within your in your firm, but just generally. And every experience is a learning experience, and we're all in this together. So thanks very much for listening to me rattle away. I think that's my 10 minutes due. And I look forward to questions.
Thanks so much, Jen, and thank you very much, Sam, Ankared and Lisa. I find that so useful. I'm sure all of the audience members will agree, and we'll have plenty of questions for you. So if you haven't yet submitted a question, please do so by the chat feature. You do still have some time, and we will try to get through as many as we can before we have to finish, which is in about half an hour's time. As I said at the start, we have already had a number of questions submitted, so we'll start with those and then move on to any further questions that you all have. So, first question we've had in, I guess this is to the whole panel really. What do you think are the main advantages and disadvantages of remote working? And are you enjoying the new normal? So Ankared, would you like to start us off on this one? Oh, you're muted.
Just unmute myself. Yeah, advantages of remote working. So obviously you're avoiding the daily commute, which is saving you time, energy. Hopefully, you know, with this period being quite difficult for people from a mental health perspective, hopefully you can use some of that time, not just for work, but for exercise or whatever it is that's going to make you feel better for the day. I think a lot of people can work more efficiently at home, so you haven't got the usual office distractions, you haven't got all those chats with your colleagues. Meetings tend to be more focused and quicker and less often, so perhaps you might end up working more efficiently. As trainees, you're probably getting a lot more autonomy than you might have expected, and hopefully, you know, in terms of your development, that will make you a more rounded lawyer. You know, you've kind of been dropped in the deep end to a certain extent, so you know, hopefully you'll thrive with that. And I think for any of you trainees that might already have families, obviously it's a massive help with having that flexibility, or if you've got, you know, elderly relatives that you care for, you know, you've just got more flexibility to help with that side of things. In terms of disadvantages, as Sam was saying, you know, you're not in that physical team environment, you're not sat in an open plan office with your colleagues, so you are missing out on overhearing those conversations and phone calls and so on. You know, hopefully you can replicate that to a certain extent, and I thought the idea about, you know, just having Zoom open for, you know, part of the day with a supervisor or even with, you know, some of your peers is a really good idea to help replicate that from home. Other more kind of casual things like, you know, your after work drinks, team building events, lunches, just social things that you do with your colleagues, you're going to miss out on. But hopefully you've got ways of keeping in touch, and depending on where you're located, then, you know, you can still be meeting up with colleagues in a socially distanced way. The disadvantage, well, I think if you haven't got a dedicated workspace, that can make it difficult as well. You know, if you live perhaps still at home with your parents, you know, and you feel like you're in your bedroom all day, that can perhaps make it difficult to separate your work and home life. So that's going to be a bit of a struggle. So I think as much as possible, if you can have a dedicated space, even if it, you know, is at the kitchen table, or if you can try and create some kind of separation, that can help. And I guess the other thing is just generally supervision. But as, you know, Sam mentioned again, you know, firms are becoming more creative with that. From my perspective, things haven't changed hugely for me. I already did most of my work from home, and I have been doing that since I had my second child in 2016. So I go into the office for client meetings, candidate meetings, networking events, work socials, those kind of things. But my day-to-day work I was doing from home anyway, so it hasn't made a huge amount of difference to me. But I am missing seeing my colleagues, you know, once or twice a week. But in terms of the work, you know, I've always found that I get more done from home. So yeah, no, I quite enjoy it actually.
That's worked out quite well for you then.
Yeah.
So Sam and Lisa, do you have any advantages or disadvantages perhaps from the sectors that you work in? Have they been impacted by remote working? Have there been any advantages for you, Sam, in litigation, for example?
So I would say that from a personal perspective, I think one of the big advantages of working from home has been the fact that everybody has been able to let guard down a bit. So, you know, I've seen clients in their casual clothes with bad hair days. I've seen their children, I've seen their dogs. And I think that's got to be a really good thing, that everybody just is allowed to be a bit more human rather than having to put up this front that, you know, some of us would have had to put up with our client. I think that's great positive to come from it all. I think the big downside from, I mean, I agree with everything that Anne-Carol just said. I think one of the other downsides of working from home, particularly as a fee earner, but I'm sure it, you know, it applies to everybody, is that you do have to force yourself to switch off. I think a lot of us have been sucked into this kind of routine of logging on at your laptop or your desktop at sort of 8 o'clock in the morning, and then there is a temptation to keep going and going because you don't have to get up and get a train to go home. You don't have to get in your car and drive home. And so I have found myself being sucked into working longer hours, and I think it is really important for everybody that we are aware of that, and we make a point of actually switching off and walking out of the room and going downstairs and having your dinner or having a break, getting out of the house. In terms of how it has affected the sector, I mean, I don't think so. I mean, again, we were all quite used to working remotely at Gowlings as well. I mean, we within the litigation team, we all would work from home at least a day a week. And so we were all pretty geared up for it, to be honest. I mean, a big change for litigation was obviously court hearings. So, you know, that has been a bit of a change for us. Most of those are going ahead remotely. So, you know, we've done sort of 2-week-long trials via Zoom. I think those are a lot more tiring. I mean, being in the trial is always very tiring, but I think it's even more so when you're on Zoom. And there's a lot more kind of faff and preparation involved in getting it all set up and working as it should. But to be honest, we've all fallen into that kind of way of working quite well now. I think it's just really important to keep an eye on, you know, on your mental health. I think that is really important. And I think from a working perspective, it's all working as it should, but I think it can feel isolating. You do have times where you feel like you're hitting a bit of a brick wall. And I think it's really important that we all sort of make sure that we're talking to colleagues about that, as well as about the work.
Absolutely. It's so important to take that time just to recharge, I think, in between a busy day. And Lisa, I know you've spoken to me about some of the challenges you faced in your team. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about that?
So I think I'd echo all the advantages that Sam has said, and the formality that's dropped, I think, has been the biggest upside to all of this. I mean, we used to start off in suits, and now I think it's made it much easier to work with clients, and you lose, as I mentioned, that front. So that's a big advantage for the whole sector. Also, the availability of webinars online makes personal development so much easier. Whereas before you used to have to travel to a room where you got cold coffee and a sandwich and listen to somebody. Now you can sit and do it in your lunch break, they're recorded, and it just makes personal development a lot easier. I started off with a big advantage being having more time due to the lack of commute. However, I've fallen into that issue that Sam was talking about with the work-life balance blur, and I find myself sitting here thinking, well, I would be on the train by now, and then all the way until I would have got home I've continued working, and it's not healthy because you're doing the same thing, you're sat in the same position. So that's something that we all need to work at how we do. Also, we have coped with this with a team that has worked in the office. So we have existing relationships and an existing team network. I think what we really need to think about is how we replicate the team going forward, because I think remote working is the future, but it's how we do that when you bond over hearing somebody on the telephone who's having an awful call, and you get to the end of it and you say, oh, that sounds awful, let me make you a cup of tea. That's all gone. The glass of wine after work, that's not gone forever, because we will be coming back into the offices. But I think we need to potentially look to coming back into the offices with a view to working from home and coming to the office for your team meetings and treating it differently. We can be creative. We don't have to go back to what we had before. From my point of view, it's much harder to deal with vulnerable clients, and it's much harder to deal or to get the personal touch, particularly if you've got a client with fluctuating capacity, you've got a really elderly client who can't switch on the video on their phone. So then the daughter comes in and sets up, and then you've got issues of duress because you know daughter's there, even though you've been told that she isn't. So we've got a real challenge in how we deal with these vulnerable clients. They're the last people that we should be going to see, but they're actually the ones that need us to go and see them above all of the others. So as a team, we've got a real challenge in how we approach that, and we're working on it. But and if we're enjoying the new normal, I wouldn't go back to how it was before. I don't like it necessarily how it is now, because it's too much focus on working from home and it's too difficult to see clients. I don't think I go back on to exactly how I had it before. So we shall see what the new normal is ours to make. So we shall see what the future holds over the next couple of years.
Thanks, Lisa. You've kind of covered the next question, actually, which was, do you think a mixture of remote working and office working will be the future? I don't know if anyone else had anything to add to that one, or I'm conscious of time, might skip on to the next couple of questions just because we have so many to get through. So this question we've had in light of the fact that trainee solicitors are undertaking most, if not all, of their training remotely, there are some clear downsides which we've discussed, such as less exposure to their team office, less opportunity to build working relationships, and potentially missing out on key work when it's allocated. So how can trainees in this situation make the most out of their training period and still secure the best opportunities for their development? Who'd like to take the first shot at this one? Lisa, I'm going to pick on you.
So you are the first group of trainees that have ever been in this situation. So you are the ones that we need to hear from most. So do be proactive. If you call anyone in your team, they're worried about you potentially, or they're happy to talk to you, because we've never done this before. So I think you in some ways you do have less exposure, but in our firm and in our team, you're very much front in our minds. So we want you to have a good training experience, and we're keen to work with you. So you might have more exposure because we want to be more involved with your training than before. I'm particularly conscious about how I delegate work, and I'm adapting as I go along and working with our current trainee to change how I delegate to fit in with her. So I think, and as I said before, turn up to the team meetings with a question, email around an interesting article or a case that you've read. Just think about visibility, and if you keep in front of everyone's mind, you will get the work.
That's really good advice. Thanks, Lisa. Sorry to everyone else on the panel. I'm going to move on to the next question just to keep it flowing and to get through as many as we can. So the next one we've had in is, how do you effectively network when working remotely? Jen, we haven't heard from you yet on the Q&A, so would you like to take this one?
Yeah, so I do a lot of networking remotely, generally anyway. It's part of my job to make sure that we continue to stay in touch with potential candidates, or even those with feedback that I sometimes don't like listening to, but have to accept it. I think it's really important that you join groups within LinkedIn as well, outside within your current groups. Also, I also think that you should also touch base with any client or any social groups within your client networks. There's no don't forget that every opportunity that, or any client interaction that you might have could just bring you not just work, but a new relationship or a new mentor. Seek out the mentorship programs within your firms. Join all of the social groups if you can, particularly the ones that you're passionate about. There's so many within your firms, and ask the question. There's sports group, there's social mobility groups, there's the ones that we know now, some of the more controversial groups that have formed following recent society issues. Have real live conversations. They don't necessarily have to be work-related questions, but find common interests. Start a conversation with someone, whether that's on social, although you must read your firm's social policy before you start doing all guns blazing on this. I always prefer phone calls, appearing in meetings, showing up to webinars, and just having regular conversation with your immediate peers and your, any external individuals that you could come across with. I think I know I'm probably speaking to a generation that's, quite a lot more younger than I, but don't rely on social media as your primary area of networking. Pick up the phone, turn up to the WebEx meet, or sorry, we only use WebEx, sorry. So turn up to the meetings if you can, turn up to social events, have an actual conversation with people.
Thanks, Jen. That's great advice. I think there's such a big emphasis on LinkedIn, isn't there, at the moment? So that's really good advice to just pick up the phone and make those connections off social media. So thank you very much. Next question we've got here. If there are no available jobs in the area of practice that you want to qualify into because of the economy, is it advisable to qualify into a different area with the intent of moving once the economy picks up again? Or is it instead better to wait until jobs open up in the practice area that you want to qualify into? Angharad, I think you might be best placed to give an answer on this one.
Yeah, I mean, it's really difficult, I think, if you have been set on a particular practice area and you've always been pretty committed to that area, to then decide to look at other areas. But as some of the other panelists said, you need to be flexible and you need to be open-minded to consider other areas, particularly those that you've done seats in, you've enjoyed your experience during those seats. So at the moment, a lot of you will just be beginning your training contracts or in your first couple of seats at your training contracts. So don't be too fixed in your ideas at this point. Wait until you get to the end of your training contract and then think about which seats you've enjoyed. And when you're thinking about which seats you've enjoyed, think as much as you can about the work that you've undertaken in those seats and what work it is that you've enjoyed, because your team and the people around you can change. So a lot of people might enjoy a particular seat because they've had a really great team and a great partner. All of that can change, if you move firms or if people leave. So think about which work you've really enjoyed the most. If you are really committed to one area, try and stick to it if you can. It's not impossible to switch disciplines post-qualification, but it is difficult. So if you do look to switch disciplines once you're a couple of years in, if you move to a new firm, a new role, then it's likely that you'll go back into that role. You'll be considered at the NQ level again. So if you're keen to, keep the momentum of your career going, ideally try and stay in the same area now if you can. If you are going to switch into a different area, then, if, for example, you're after a corporate role, maybe look at banking, areas that are complementary to that. Or if you want to do, say, property litigation, have a look at banking litigation or just general commercial litigation. So think about areas that are complementary. For some of you, you might want to consider signing up, if it gets to the point you haven't got an NQ role, you could look at signing up to some of the consultancy type services that some of the law firms offer. So the likes of, Vario at Pinson's, and, there's various ones that different firms offer. So you can sign up that and then hopefully still build your experience in that area. Or look at temporary roles, look at in-house options. perhaps as a last case scenario, then you might consider looking at paralegal roles just to tide you over and build more experience until there is a qualified role available in your preferred area. So I think there's, I'd say keep an open mind, try and follow the preferred area that you've got if possible, but then, try and think creatively as well.
Thank you, that's very helpful. So moving on, I think you again, Ankarad, and Jen, you may want to contribute on this one as well. What would your main tips be for writing an NQ CV, and would you perhaps change your advice in light of COVID?
No, I think make sure that your CV is concise and it displays the impact of your involvement in those transactions. The format of the CV actually, for me, has always been, it's the window to who you are as a person. So I do think it's really important to keep it brief and keep it interesting. Those are just the main things. I don't think there's any need to change. There's no need to be, I guess, sending electronic CVs via LinkedIn, because that's not, I think as much as you possibly can. I don't necessarily think there is a need to change the formatting or the way that you put yourself forward. But I do think it's really important to keep a CV concise and impactful. The best candidates, I think the realities are, it probably takes a recruiter not even a minute to know whether a candidate's a good fit for a role. But that's not because you're not right for the role. It's just you have to look at the number of candidates in play, and also the type of profile that role lends itself to. So if there's any, I guess, specific advice I can give you, is that think about the type of firm and the type of practice area that you want to qualify into, and then be specific in terms of what experience you actually have that's aligned to that practice group, what involvement you might have had in that area, and make sure that it's, you put your top line best, deals. Make sure that it's concise and simple.
Yeah, I'd agree with Jen. I don't think there's anything different to do in respect of writing your CV in light of COVID. So all the usual guidance would apply. If you take a look on our website, there's a section there, knowledge base and careers advice, and then CVs and interviews. And there's a template CV there that you can download and then use that as your kind of base for writing your CV. But all the usual tips would apply. I think probably one of the only points would be if you have had a bit of a gap because there hasn't been a role available in your preferred area, or it's not a role available immediately for you on qualification, then just look to speak to your recruiter and explain the reason for that gap, the background, what the situation was at your firm, and just be really honest and upfront really about what your situation is.
Thank you, thanks both. So next question we've got is sort of catered for, I guess, the law students who might be in attendance today who are yet to secure a training contract. So I don't know if Sam, if you might want to comment on this one. Is training contract recruitment still going ahead in general at firms, and which skills attributes do you think are now the most important for a trainee to demonstrate?
Sorry, I was on mute a minute. It hasn't, I don't think it has changed in terms of what we'll be looking for from our trainees. The process has changed a little, obviously. I mean, it's all taking place remotely, but that aside, we're still following exactly the same process as we have in other years. In terms of the skills that we're looking for in our trainees, they need to be great communicators. They need to be able to work as a team and with other people, and to adapt their approach depending upon the people that they're working with. We are looking for people who are creative, who are looking for creative solutions to problems, who are able to help clients find creative solutions to problems, and who can innovate. It's really important, for obvious reasons, that our trainees are great at managing their time and managing their workload and being able to juggle things. and whilst also sort of maintaining a really good eye for detail and you know, making sure that they keep on top of all of that. I think that's it. I'm trying to think if there's anything else that we sort of include on our list, our wish list. Having some degree of commercial awareness as well. I spotted, I'm not sure if we're going to get to that later, but I spotted that someone has asked about what skills trainees should be looking to develop now that there is a little bit more time to work on personal development. And I think one of the things that they could be doing is improving their commercial awareness. It's quite difficult to find the time to read articles, to attend webinars, to really sort of improve your knowledge of what's going on across the industry when you're sort of knee deep in various documents and then having to commute. So I think that's one of the areas that you can really focus on as both as a trainee, but also someone who's looking to obtain a training contract.
Thank you, Sam. As you said, we've had quite a few questions come in that I'd like to get to. So I'm going to whiz ahead because I think the other questions that we had submitted have really been covered. Stop sharing that background. So one of the questions we've had in is from someone who has said they're due to qualify in September, but they can qualify earlier in March should they choose to. So would you recommend qualifying earlier, or are this person's prospects likely to be better later on in the year? So if they qualify in September. Ankarad, do you have any comment on this question in terms of when is best to be qualifying at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, I think, to be honest with you, I think probably the later the better. Just give the market as good a chance as possible to recover. So if it was me that was training at the moment, I'd be preferring to qualify as late as possible, really. And at least in the meantime, you've still got a job.
Absolutely.
Oh, I think it depends as well, as if your preferred practice area jobs come up, then why wait? Just do it.
Yeah.
So I might go to Lisa for this next question that's come in. How best can trainees keep in touch with a team that they might want to qualify into once they've moved seats? So if they're working from home, obviously, if they've already done the seat, it's quite difficult perhaps to have that organic connection when you're working remotely that you know otherwise in the firm you might have just seen them in the kitchen or in the lift on the way up to work. So how can you still maintain that connection?
So sign up for any updates that the team are delivering. So if we quite often have internal updates, particularly in the housing section, so make sure you're seen on the list to sign up to that. Just have a quick coffee or catch up with somebody over lunch or at 10 o'clock when there's a natural break in time. Email and ask questions about a matter perhaps you've been working on. Keep involvement in a matter so that you just show an interest in general, and keep up with the new trainee that's gone there. Make sure your handover is really good. Make sure that you go back and keep in touch with the fee earners as well. Nobody minds if you call them and say, can I have 5-10 minutes chat to catch up on that matter that I really wanted to see the end of? And that's a good in because it shows you had a genuine interest, and everyone likes talking about their work.
Thank you. So just looking into the future, if we do have a mixture of remote working or office-based working, Sam, I might go to you on this one. Do you think NQs would be looked at unfavourably if they ask to work from home?
I don't think so. No, I mean, before we went into this slightly strange new world that we're in, we were already as a team, everybody across the team, NQ and above, was able to work from home 1 day a week. Our PAs all worked from home 1 day a week. The only people who didn't were our trainees, and that's primarily because of that kind of osmosis issue that we were talking about earlier. I really don't. I think this is going to be the new normal. I agree with Lisa. I do not think we'll all be working at home full time, and frankly, I would hate to do that because I miss my pod. I'm amazed that's a universal term. But I do miss my colleagues. But I think all of us will be working at home at least part of the time, and I don't think anyone, you know, would think badly of you asking to do that.
Okay, thanks, Sam. I'm really sorry, but it's now 8 o'clock, and unfortunately we're not going to have time to go through any more questions. But thank you so much to our panelists. You've given some really fantastic advice this evening, and thank you to everybody else who has turned up. I hope you found this event useful and that you are leaving today feeling a little bit more positive about the situation. If you have any comments or questions about this session, please get in touch with BTSS via our social media or on our website, which is www.thebtss.com. But that is it from us, really. So thank you again, and I hope you all have a great evening.
Lovely. Thanks, Amelia.
Thank you.
Thanks very much for organising.
Thank you. Nice to meet you all.
Yes, you too. Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.